Hey book nerds, welcome to my channel. So in honour of October and Halloween and everything, I am doing my horror trope videos. So the last video was 5 horror tropes I love. This is 5-ish horror tropes that I hate or dislike. I really struggled with this video, to be honest. I've done this for other genres, I've done this for thrillers, I've done this for contemporaries, and this was the hardest one for me to plan because I really love horror and I really struggled to kind of articulate the horror that I don't like. So this isn't quite 5 items, but some of them are more like umbrella items, and you'll see what I mean when I go through the list. But yeah, I'll link all my previous videos down below if you're curious. And I'm just going to start talking about the tropes. So the first trope I hate is when sexual elements are used as part of the horror, and that's like the umbrella that I'm using for this first point. So I've read a lot of really bad horror anthologies where they use kind of sex and body horror relating to sex as the only horrific elements. And it's hard to kind of articulate unless you've read it yourself, but I just don't enjoy that kind of horror. I just don't think that that alone makes for an interesting horror story, and particularly because sex is so prevalent in horror fiction, I don't think it's particularly unique to do that either. As always, there's going to be examples of these tropes done well, but I have yet to find an example of this trope done well. And also under this little umbrella, I'm just going to shove in the rapist horror guy. So this is a staple of every Stephen King novel ever. I love Stephen King, I'm not hating on Stephen King, but he does this a lot, and it's happened in a lot of other horror books, maybe because of the influence of Stephen King. But this is when not the like monster or the entity or whatever is the horror of the story, but this is when one of the normal human characters is also a rapist or will like sexually assault one of the female characters at some point. And this is kind of done, I imagine, to show that humanity is awful and to add an extra layer of horror and terror to the female characters' lives. But I just think it's so overused and so overdone at this point that it's almost like the authors want like are turned on by this and they want to include it just to have it as part of the story, and that's the impression it gives off to me. I'm not saying that's how it's written, but I'm saying that's the impression that I get from that, and that's why I don't enjoy it. So yeah, that's kind of that first umbrella trope with a little more specific thing thrown in. As a little PS to that, I actually have a story that I read in a Christmas horror anthology that was the worst horror story I've ever read. It was extremely sexual, it was extremely weird. I don't think I can talk about it on YouTube because of the content, but if you are curious and would like to know what this terrible story is, then do let me know and I will tell you what it was about, because it is the worst thing I've ever read and it still haunts me to this day. The next point on this list is kind of 2 things smushed together, which is why this is like a 5-ish list. So it is like eldritch abominations and alien-based horror. So I don't connect particularly well when the horror is an abstract thing. The exception to this is some Stephen King works. So with It, for example, I think he makes it work. But the majority of books that use abstract eldritch horrors as the horror of the book, I just don't connect with, and I think that's because for me, I like my horror to be character focused, and that's where I get all my enjoyment of the story from. I connect to the characters, I can appreciate the human sensation of fear and terror and the way humans respond to death and horrific situations, and that's what keeps me interested in the story. I think that aliens and eldritch abominations are just one step too far in my brain, and I know logically they're not less realistic than ghosts or monsters or any of that kind of thing, but I feel like you lose a sense of the grounded horror story. I do like my horror stories quite simple in terms of plot, and most stories that contain eldritch abominations tend to be more complicated as well and a bit weirder, which means I disconnect from the story. So this is very much a personal taste one, but yeah, I don't like those tropes. The next trope I hate or dislike is body horror, and this kind of links a little bit to the sexual horror stuff, but I'm treating this as a separate thing because I'm talking about it in a non-sexual context. I hate this mainly for the reason that I have OCD and I can't physically read about certain things. So I can't read about, I don't know if there's like vomit or other bodily functions involved. I just can't read about that kind of thing, and I don't think it's horrific, I think it's gross. So I don't like that the author feels like that's how they have to get that response from the audience. They don't try and create something that is scary, they just try and create something that is disgusting. And I feel like disgust and fear are very different emotions, and if your horror story relies solely on disgust, then it's not a good horror story. Again, this is just my opinion. I can deal with body horror if it is done as part of a larger thing. So for example, again, in Gerald's Game there is a very graphic, horrific body horror bit in that story, and I can't really read it. I do skim over it a little bit, but I still love that story on the whole, and it doesn't ruin the story for me. So it's not that books can't have any type of body horror in, because that's a big part of horror, as particularly serial killer stuff. Mutilation and all that doesn't fit into it for me. I don't enjoy that kind of thing, but I don't mind that kind of thing, whereas I actively dislike when it goes down the more disgusting bodily fluid route, shall we say. And the final trope I'm going to talk about, because I didn't want to end on that note and I literally just thought of another one, so this is very off the cusp, as it were. I don't like when horror books use dream sequences, and this is a big one, and a lot of people hate dream sequences, and they always say in every writing class ever that you shouldn't use dream sequences, and I'm just going to jump straight on that bandwagon and say I don't like dream sequences. It's difficult because I can see the appeal of them. You get to write really cool scenes that you couldn't write otherwise with no consequences, but the no consequences part is exactly the problem. And you can use dreams to explore characters' psyches and that kind of thing, but at the same time it's just overdone. And the worst is when you're reading a scene and you realise that it is a dream sequence, because you have that slow dawning dread when something major happens that the author can't take back, and you go, oh my god, that character's dead, like what's going to happen? And then you realise that what's going to happen is the author's going to click their fingers and pretend that never happened, because it's a dream sequence and they can make weird stuff happen. Again, dream sequences can be done well. They can be very powerful forms of foreshadowing, and they can be really cool if you use them in that way, but even so, I just think most stories don't need that dream sequence, and you can cut them out and it won't do anything. So yeah, those are the 5-ish horror tropes that I hate / dislike. I'm intrigued to see what people make of this video. I would like to know your thoughts, if you agree with me on the points. If you disagree with me, that's fine, please do. Just be nice about it. I always like discussions of like why you like the things that I don't like. I find that really interesting, so I will be nice and if you will be nice, kind of thing. But yeah, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give me a thumbs up, it'll help me out massively, and I hope to see you next time.